Today's Gospel is coming to us from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Sorry. How's that? Is that better? Okay. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that falls to me. And he divided his living between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took his journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in loose living. And when he had spent everything, a great famine arose in that country, and he began to be in want. So he went and joined himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have fed on the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was yet at a distance, his father saw him, and he had compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the father said to him, and the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and make merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to make merry. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what this meant. And he said to him, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, Lo, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your living with harlots, you killed him the fat calf. And he said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to make merry and be glad, for this was your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. This is the word of the Lord for the people of the Lord.
Praise be to God. I think there's several questions for us to ponder today as we think about this scripture verse. And so I want to start with a show of hands this morning. Is there anyone here who has no regrets in life? No? Is there anyone here who never made a bad choice? Anyone here who has not hurt someone along the way? Is there anyone here who's never had to humble yourself? Oh my. Now, while my hand was up encouraging you to raise yours, if the shoe fit, mine really wasn't up. Because I couldn't have raised my hand on any of those either. Today we take a look at the prodigal son. Now, some may sit back and say, oh, we've heard that story before. It's way too familiar. We don't need to hear the story of the prodigal son again. But there's a danger in that, lest we miss the significance of the message that Jesus was trying to teach. I had an instructor at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Chicago, in Evanston, Illinois, actually, some years ago. His expertise was the book of Genesis. He had taught the book of Genesis for approximately 30 years. He said in the summer, late summer, before the fall semester starts, he said, I always sit down and I read through the book of Genesis, all 50 chapters. He says, I study it, and I think about how it applies to my life. 30 years he's been teaching it, and for 30 years he's been rereading the entire book of Genesis before starting to teach it again. He says, you know, I have yet to read through the book of Genesis and not find something different this time, each time. He says, in a lot of cases, it's because something in my life changed, and I'm looking at what the text is saying in a different way than what I might have looked at it on an earlier occasion. Now, I love this story of the prodigal son myself. I don't know how you feel about it. I call him the Wayward Son number 1. And I think part of the reason why I like the story is because in many respects, I can relate. It's my story. And I venture a guess, if we were being totally honest with ourselves, that it's probably your story too, at least in part. The question comes for all of us to consider, are you the wayward son number 1? Are you, or daughter, can't forget daughters in there too. Are you the loving father, the forgiving father, who went to extreme to welcome his son back? Or are you the one I will refer to as the wayward son number 2? The one who stayed home for all the wrong reasons. The one who was filled with anger and resentment and an unforgiving heart. Now, I say that we're all in that story somewhere. There may be times when we find ourselves as more than one of these characters. I don't know. But based on this text, verses 22 to 24, it said, but the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. Now, there's an assumption that we should be able to make from that text, and that is the fact that we're talking about a very wealthy person, a man of influence. He obviously had great wealth because he had servants, he had the robe, he had a ring to put on his son's finger. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, and the significance of the ring. So we know it was a wealthy family. And we also know that the son wanted his estate, his portion of the estate, and he wanted it now. Oh, I missed part of the text. Sorry about that. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, so they began to celebrate. So we know that the son wanted a portion of his estate now. What are some of the emotions that we might see as we think about this story? As you think, and by the way, this is a participatory sermon. And I didn't tell you that ahead of time. But I'm going to be looking for some answers. When you think about the wayward son and what he did and what must have led him to make that decision, to reach that point in time in his life, what might be some of the emotions that he would have faced? Anybody?
Failure.
I'm sorry?
Failure.
Failure?
Humility.
In the story, yes. Let's talk about the very beginning of that story. What the son's, some of his first reactions should be. Their first emotions might have been. Let me give you a start. I see there a struggle for freedom. Wanting to get out from underneath his parents, his father's thumbprint. Wanting to get out on his own. Wanting some independence. Would you say maybe some rebellion on the part of the son?
A sense of entitlement.
A sense of what?
Entitlement.
A sense of entitlement? Yes?
Greed.
Greed? What do we see later as in this son? As he's gone and he's secured his freedom, we're now seeing some deep regret, aren't we? Some humility. That was the word that came up before. While he was out spending his money, he would have been great joy, excitement about this new life. What about the father? What emotions would the father have faced when the son first approached him? Anyone? How about a broken heart?
Disappointment.
Disappointment.
Worry.
I'm sorry?
Worry.
Worry. Those are the emotions you and I would have, aren't they? What do we see at the end when the son is coming home? I see joy. I see excitement. I see a sense of relief on the father's part. Oh, thank you, God. He's coming home. I see all of those emotions. Okay, here's an easier one. What emotions do we see in a wayward son? Number 2. Jealousy. What was that one?
Resentment.
Resentment. Anger. Who was he angry with? He's angry with his dad. He's also angry with his brother. I think another one that we see there is unforgiveness. He's not about to accept it. Okay. It's going to be a 3-part series. I'm going to get into parts of this message, parts of this story that hopefully you've never heard before. Or if you have, maybe it's been a long time, maybe when hearing it this time, it'll be a little different. It's a 3-part series. We're going to look at all 3 persons. We're also going to take a look at the impact, the cultural impact that these decisions would have had on each one of them and on their family and on their community. Wayward son number 1. He wanted his share and he wanted it now. By Jewish custom, Jewish law, the youngest son was entitled to 1/3 of the father's estate. The oldest son was entitled to 2/3. But not until the father died. There was an exception. And that is if the father retired and passed the responsibility of managing the estate on to his eldest son, then there would be some transition. But this was the youngest son. This was the youngest. He wanted his share now. It's as if he is saying, hey, I'm going to get it anyway when you die, so why not just give it to me now? Putting it bluntly. But that's basically what he's saying. For the youngest son to do what the youngest son did was an arrogant disregard for his father's authority, and it was totally unacceptable in the Jewish community. Now the father, by giving him his share, his 1/3, set aside Jewish custom an accepted practice. When he did that, gave what he had to his son, he could have given up his station in life. And by doing so, the father put himself at great risk for violating Jewish law and tradition. He could have lost all respect in the community. Now there was a custom at that time when someone offended the father in the way that the father had been offended. The custom was to break a clay pot at the feet of the offender. It says this relationship is so damaged, so broken, it can never be put back together again. And it says to the community, to the Jewish community, if this person ever returns, whoever gets to him first can do whatever you want to do to him, including putting him to death. Luke 15, 13 to 16. Not long after that, by the way, did everybody's attention? Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set out for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything there was, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. The Life Application Bible says pigs, by the law of Moses, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, said that pigs were very unclean. They could not be eaten. They could not be used for a sacrifice. The Jews, not wanting to defile themselves, would not even touch a pig. For the son to degrade himself and feed them was bad enough, but to think about eating the food the pigs had touched was about as low as anyone could go. It would have humiliated that son beyond belief. End of quote. Verse 17, beginning with 17. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your servants." So he got up and he went to his father. You know, the youngest son, like many who are rebellious and immature, wanted to be free to live as he pleased. Any of us that never felt that way? And like many of us, he had to hit rock bottom. Had to hit rock bottom before he came to his senses. Anyone relate? Yeah, I venture a guess there's several of us that can. It oftentimes takes great sadness and pain and tragedy to cause people to look back to the only one who can give you help. The youngest son began making plans to return home, not knowing what he was going to find when he got there. He knew full well that his life was in jeopardy if he stayed. But it's also in jeopardy if he returned home. Remember the pot? Whoever got to him first, do with him whatever you want. There's a story that's told of the King of Spain, of a father and his teenage son who had a relationship that had been strained and finally hit the rocks, and the son ran away from home. And the father began an immediate journey looking for his rebellious son. And finally in Madrid, in a last desperate effort to find him, the father put an ad in the newspaper. The ad read, "Dear Paco, meet me in front of the newspaper office at noon tomorrow. All is forgiven. I love you. Your father." The next day at noon, in front of the newspaper office, 800 Pacos showed up, seeking forgiveness and love from their fathers. Grace is an amazing thing, isn't it? God's grace is there for all who seek it. How do we seek his grace? Psalm 51:17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Contrite means repentant heart. Have you drifted from God? Even a little? Are you feeling low and perhaps a little disheartened? Do you need to spend some time either in the pew or here at the rail? Some time in prayer. You're invited. I invite you, anyone who wishes, to spend the next few moments in prayer in your pew. Or if you would like, you're invited to come to the rail. And I don't know how long that's happened, how long ago that happened in this church. Sadly, in a lot of Methodist churches, I find it hasn't happened in a long time. But while we're thinking about and praying about where we are in our relationship with God,